I'd like to start first by talking about what this video series is not going to be about, and that's teaching the pedagogy of rhythm, how to teach basic rhythm. I think that there's some better resources for that. If you want some ideas about how to teach rhythm in general, I recommend that you go to an elementary music education channel, something like ORF, Kodai, Delcros. They have wonderful content on that, much better than what I could give. In fact, I steal a lot, especially from Delcros with the motion and all the stuff that they do, and I think those are better resources. So what this video series is going to try to accomplish is I'm going to talk about the unique problems with rhythm that string players face and some sort of trouble areas that affect rhythm because of the bow, and perhaps how to solve some of those issues. If you're watching this video series and you're coming from a vocal background or a band background and you're new to teaching strings, that's great. I'm glad you're here. I hope you're getting a lot out of this, and you're probably already comfortable teaching rhythm. That's probably something that you can already do very well and can apply to your string orchestra classes. But you might be having trouble with certain rhythms, and maybe if my teaching orchestra project has been successful, this content's making its way to people who are coming from band backgrounds, from choral backgrounds, that are now teaching strings. And these folks are already great musicians. They're already great at teaching rhythm. They've been doing this for a long time. But I'd like to break some of this stuff down and ask the question, could some of the rhythmic problems in your orchestra be because of the bow? I'd like to first address long rhythmic values, whole notes and half notes. Now, typically what happens when a student's working on their individual musicianship is that once they start playing whole notes and half notes, those rhythmic values tend to drag. And a lot of times in an ensemble, that's because they're not keeping an internal pulse and they're listening to faster rhythmic values and they're trying to adapt to that, and they're always going to be late because they're not internalizing and playing right with the beat. And so, generally speaking, if your students are dragging on long rhythmic values, that could just be because of their basic musicianship, and that's something that you can address. But what if their long note values are rushing, which is less common? It's less common for musicianship generally, but it can be very common for string players because of the bow. And just think about where they are in the bow and how much bow they have and where they need to go. A lot of times your students might be rushing certain passages because they don't have enough bow to work with. So, you're bowing to the tip and then you run out of bow. What do you do next? Well, logically, you just go on to the next note and you rush a little bit. And this is very common. If you have a scenario where there's long note values, or even just one long note value, and the students don't seem to be counting it very well, maybe it's not a counting issue, maybe it's a technique issue. So I would suggest that you look at what comes before that note and what comes after it, and how much bow they need to use to play that note. So whatever comes before it, are they setting up for failure or success? Or is it putting them in the right part of the bow so that they have enough bow to work with? If not, you might have to add a bow lift. You might have to do something with that note before to get the student in the right part of the bow, to give them more bow to work with. And then, of course, what's coming after that note? Is it another long note value? Is it a bunch of fast or short notes? What's going on there? Because that can influence the rhythm as well. Test my theory of whether it's a bowing issue instead of a counting issue. I recommend just experimenting. Try giving them more bow to work with and see if that doesn't just fix the problem all by itself. Maybe they are counting. Maybe they just don't have enough bow. A lot of times, starting in a different place of the bow will just solve all of your rhythmic issues. And long bows is one of those cases. Shorter, faster note values. A lot of times those tend to rush, which seems to be counterintuitive because the long notes tend to drag and the short notes tend to rush. You would think it would be the opposite. You would think the longer notes would tend to rush, and sometimes they do in strings. I just went over that. And when students are developing their basic musicianship, the short, faster note values tend to rush, which is weird because they're already fast, so you want to play them faster. But yeah, that's the tendency for students that are working on their general musicianship. That's what you typically see, regardless of instrument or discipline. But what if you're playing a passage of music, or your students are playing a passage of music, and the opposite is taking place? What if your students are dragging on these fast patterns? Or what if it's a different issue, like your orchestra is playing eighth notes and they just have trouble staying together on the eighth notes, and you're putting a metronome on it, you're giving them the beat, you're doing all this stuff, but the bows are just going every which way, and they're not able to keep a steady beat. What do? In a lot of beginning string concerts, particularly the December concert, I just kind of hold my breath, because beginners can be so unpredictable. And a lot of times when they're moving from longer note values to shorter note values, there starts to be phasing in the ensemble, and you're just like, oh, is this gonna hang in there? Is this gonna tank, or are we gonna make it to the finish line together? And although yes, beginners are more inconsistent, but there's things that you can do with their technique to try to make them more consistent, especially if they have eighth notes or something like that. And one of those things that you can do is make sure that everybody is in the right part of the bow. And yes, beginners tend to be more inconsistent. That's just the nature of the beast. But there are things that you can do to teach them to be more consistent, to try to get a better result in that concert, and maybe take a little bit less pressure and anxiety off you as the director. And one of those things is to make sure that everybody is in the same part of the bow. For eighth notes, I recommend that everybody start in the middle of the bow. Now, when I say start in the middle of the bow, I don't really mean start exactly in the middle of the bow and then bow out to the upper half and back. What I mean is, and a lot of this holds true for beginning string players, is that your bowings should start in the lower half of the bow, cross the middle, and go into the upper half of the bow and then back, so that the middle is like the average of your bow stroke. And so if you're playing an eighth note, it could be like this. If you're playing a quarter note and expands out, well, then you need to work a little lower to the lower half of the bow, and just having everybody just gravitate towards the middle of the bow may solve your problem, because the bow's going to feel a little different in each part of the bow, and some players are going to naturally play faster or slower in different parts. And so I think the middle is a good starting point. For your violins and violas, a lot of them are going to gravitate to playing in the upper half of the bow for eighth notes. You're going to see them play exclusively at the upper half for that. And a lot of the times that's because they don't have the wrist flexibility to get to the middle and get to the lower half. And so naturally, using the shoulder is going to be more comfortable at that extreme in the upper half of the bow, and that's where you're going to see them play. And then for your lower strings, it's going to be the opposite. You're going to see them playing their eighth notes exclusively at the frog, because, again, they lack that wrist flexibility. A lot of times for them, it's that extension of the pinky. For violinists and violists, it tends to be the thumb. And, they're doing everything with the shoulder at the frog, because they don't have the wrist flexibility to play in the middle. So now you've got violinists and violists in the upper half, and you've got cellos and bass players in the lower half of the bow. And hey, it's no wonder why your group's not staying together, right? So let's fix that technique, let's fix the bow hold, and then everybody play in the middle. Now that everybody is in the same part of the bow when they play their eighth notes, it's much more likely to stay together. Okay, so let's say you're still having some issues with rushing or dragging on the eighth notes. It's now a tempo issue instead of just a rhythmic issue where people aren't staying together. Okay, so if you need to go a little faster, maybe try moving that spot a little more towards the upper half of the bow and seeing if that helps the students play a little quicker. And if you need to slow it down a little bit, perhaps move a little bit closer to the balance point, and that might naturally allow the students to play those short rhythmic values a little slower. Think about the method book that you're using right now in class, and think about when compound time is introduced. When is 6/8 introduced for the first time? And in most of these method books, it's fairly late. It's like book 2 before anybody starts playing in compound time. And so why is this? And then also you'll notice with your more advanced orchestras, your middle school orchestras, maybe even your high school orchestras, when your advanced groups are playing in compound time, all of a sudden they start really struggling with rhythm, and there aren't a whole lot of string pieces that are written in compound time in the first place. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, why is that? One of the challenges in playing in compound time is that we tend to have asymmetrical note values, like quarter note, eighth note, quarter note, eighth note in a 6/8 meter. And if those bowings are detached and it's down, up, up, well, that's going to create an issue because we've got one note that's longer and one note shorter, and then because of our bowing, we have a down bow and an up bow. So what's going to happen? If we play a quarter note the same bow speed that we play the eighth note, well, it's a 2-to-1 ratio for your bowing. So you're going to play down, up, down, up, down, up, down, and eventually you're going to be at the tip, and then you're stuck. What do you do there? And as I spoke about earlier, moving to the upper half of the bow is going to tend to make students play quicker on eighth notes. So then that eighth note is going to start coming quicker and quicker. And when that eighth note comes quicker, the quarter note's going to end up being longer, and it's going to, now we don't have a 2-to-1 ratio, we have a 2 and some change to point whatever and some change ratio, and that's going to make everything worse, and it's going to make your orchestra fall apart. So when we have unequal, asymmetrical detached bowings, we have to play both notes the same length, even though they take up less time. So the quarter note gets the same amount of bow that the eighth note is going to get, which means that usually we're going to have to use less bow on the quarter note instead of more bow on the eighth note. And the reason why is because when we start to push our up bows like this, it really, not only does it get in the way of your phrasing and just kind of sounds bad, but it also can create those rhythmic issues because we start to get like this hiccup from the up bow. If your students are having an issue with compound time, particularly at the points where they're playing these detached rhythms with asymmetrical or unequal bowings, I recommend that they play the quarter note or whatever rhythmic value it is with a shorter and heavier bow, and the eighth note with the same bow that they would normally use, just a little lighter, so that they can maintain the phrase integrity and they can kind of stay in the same part of the bow, stay consistent, and make sure the whole orchestra is in the same part of the bow. This can also be the case in odd meters, like 3/4 time, for instance. If you have a half note, quarter note, or quarter note, half note, and they're detached, you're going to have a similar problem with the 2-to-1 ratio of bowing, and a lot of times you're going to want to adjust that half note so that you can stay in the same part of the bow, or adjust the quarter note, so you can be in the part of the bow that you need to. It's going to take some playing with. With these odd meters, it can create additional challenges, and it can make students rush certain rhythmic values. It can make them rush the quarter note or drag the half note because they're in a weird part of the bow, and they got into a weird part of the bow because of the unequal bowing. So one trick that you can use is to just even them out, which can be very possible in a lot of sections, So if you're playing down, up, make sure that your up bows are a little quicker to get you back, or that your half notes, which is probably a lot easier, to make those a little slower and a little heavier so that you push into the string down, up, down, up. And I think with the second variation of that, most of the time you're going to be more successful in your classroom, and the music's going to sound a whole lot better if you do it that way. But there may be some times where that's not exactly feasible, so you kind of have to be able to do both. If your orchestra is having problems with a certain passage or a certain rhythm or a certain whatever, and they can't seem to stay with the beat, it might not be a musicianship issue, it might not be a counting issue, it might just be a bowing issue. So look for those spots and see where they are in the bow, what happens before, what happens after, and see if you can get them to a place where the bowing is easier, more conducive to that rhythm. You can turn your metronome up to 11 and just shout at them, count, 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 till you're blue in the face, but it might not be that they're not counting. It might not be that they can't hear the metronome. It might just be that they need to play in the middle, or that they need to use less bow on this note, or they need to have a slightly faster up bow here. So look for those spots and see if a bowing change or a bow placement change doesn't just fix all the problems and solve a lot of issues and ultimately make your class a whole lot less frustrating.